I don't understand. Emily asked me to be here. Dad, please. Don't make this harder than it needs to be.
Harder? She's my granddaughter. There are important people here today. And what exactly am I? After everything, you're asking me not to attend my own granddaughter's wedding?
We're just trying to avoid a situation.
A situation?
I spent my whole life making sure none of you were ever ashamed of where you came from.
We think it's best.
Give this to Emily.
For most of the guests, it looked like the perfect wedding. The flowers had arrived on time. The musicians were already playing. Waiters moved carefully through rows of white chairs. Family members smiled for photographs that would eventually fill social media feeds and holiday albums for years to come. And yet, less than 30 minutes before the ceremony began, an elderly man stood alone in the parking lot staring at the venue where his granddaughter was about to get married. His name was Walter Carter. At 78 years old, Walter moved slowly. Arthritis had stiffened his hands. His hearing wasn't what it used to be. The navy blue suit hanging from his shoulders wasn't new. In fact, he'd owned it for nearly a decade. But he had polished his shoes twice that morning. Because today mattered. This wasn't just any wedding. This was Emily's wedding. The granddaughter he had helped raise. The little girl who used to sit on his lap and ask him stories about the old days. The granddaughter who once promised him that no matter what happened, he would always have a seat beside her. But on this particular morning, something strange happened. Before Walter could reach the entrance, 3 people intercepted him. Not strangers. Not security guards. His own children. What followed lasted less than 10 minutes. There were no screams. No dramatic scene. No public argument. Most guests never heard a word. But several people noticed something unusual. The elderly man arrived smiling. And left looking as though a piece of him had been taken away. Then he disappeared. The wedding continued. The photographs were taken. The ceremony moved forward. And everyone pretended nothing had happened. But hours later, in the middle of the reception, a revelation would emerge that would leave guests stunned, force family members into uncomfortable silence, and expose a truth that had been hidden for decades. A truth that began with one question. Why would a family remove the man who had sacrificed everything for them from the most important day of his granddaughter's life? And perhaps an even more troubling question. Who was really being protected that day? Because the more people learned about Walter Carter, the harder it became to believe he was the embarrassment. And the closer they came to discovering who truly had something to hide. The story starts long before the wedding. Long before the arguments. Long before the family learned that appearances can be far more fragile than they seem. To understand what happened, we first need to understand Walter. And the family that almost erased him from their most important celebration. At first glance, the Carters appeared to be the kind of American success story people admire. 3 successful adult children. Beautiful homes. Professional careers. A growing family. The kind of family that looked polished in photographs and respectable in public. To outsiders, they seemed united. But families often have 2 histories. The one they tell the world. And the one they quietly avoid discussing. Walter occupied an unusual place inside this family. Everyone loved him in theory. Everyone praised him during holidays. Everyone referred to him as the family's foundation. Yet somehow, when important decisions were made, his voice seemed to matter less and less. By the time Emily's wedding arrived, something had changed. Questions lingered beneath every polite conversation. Why were Walter's children so concerned about his presence? What exactly did they believe he might do? Was there really a risk he would embarrass them? Or was the wedding threatening to expose something they had spent years trying to keep hidden? Before we go further, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We always love hearing from you. And if you're new here, consider subscribing so you never miss stories like this. Because what happened inside this family wasn't really about a wedding. It wasn't even about an elderly father. It was about memory. About gratitude. And about the stories families rewrite when success arrives. The deeper Emily looked, the the more she realized that the version of her family she had always believed might not be the complete truth. And what she discovered would change how everyone at that wedding viewed Walter Carter forever. Walter's story began nearly 50 years earlier. Back then, nobody would have predicted that his family would one day be regarded as successful. Walter worked long hours as a maintenance mechanic in a manufacturing plant outside Columbus, Ohio. The work was physically demanding. The pay was modest. But it provided enough to support his wife, Margaret, and their 3 young children. Life wasn't luxurious. The family lived in a small house with creaky floors and aging furniture. Vacations were rare. New clothes were purchased only when necessary. Yet by most accounts, they were happy. Then everything changed. Margaret died unexpectedly when the youngest child was only 6 years old. One moment Walter was a husband planning for the future. The next, he was a grieving father trying to raise 3 children alone. Friends suggested he remarry. Relatives offered advice. Some quietly doubted whether he could manage. But Walter made a decision. His children would come first. No matter the cost. What followed were years of sacrifices that few people ever fully understood. And the most surprising part? Many of those sacrifices would eventually become the very things his children wanted forgotten. Stay with me. Because the choices Walter made during those years would become the key to understanding everything that happened on Emily's wedding day. Walter rarely spoke about those years. If someone asked how he managed after Margaret's death, he usually shrugged and changed the subject. But people who knew the family back then remembered details that never appeared in family photo albums. They remembered a father working double shifts while still making it home in time to help with homework. They remembered him falling asleep in a chair because he was too exhausted to make it to bed. They remembered school plays where Walter sat alone in the audience because there was no spouse beside him anymore. Most of all, they remembered a man who refused to let his children feel the full weight of what the family had lost. His oldest son, David, was bright and ambitious. Walter noticed it early. David talked about becoming an attorney before most children even understood what lawyers did. His daughter, Susan, excelled academically and dreamed of becoming a physician. His youngest son, Michael, showed a talent for business and leadership. Walter encouraged every dream. He attended parent conferences. He worked overtime. He skipped purchases he wanted for himself. When the roof leaked, he patched it himself. When the family car broke down, he repaired it in the driveway. When college acceptance letters arrived years later, Walter celebrated harder than anyone. What his children didn't fully understand was how close some of those dreams had come to disappearing. To pay tuition expenses, Walter emptied savings accounts. He sold land that had been in his family for generations. He cashed out retirement investments. At one point, according to financial records Emily would later uncover, he even took a second mortgage on the house. The children knew he helped. They didn't know the extent. Walter made sure of that. Whenever they thanked him, he told them the same thing. Just make your life count. And for many years, they did. David became a respected attorney. Susan entered medicine. Michael built a successful real estate company. Their lives transformed. Larger homes replaced the modest neighborhood where they had grown up. Luxury vehicles replaced used family sedans. Professional circles replaced old community friendships. At first, Walter felt proud. He had achieved exactly what he wanted. His children had opportunities he never had. Yet somewhere along the way, subtle changes began appearing. Not dramatic changes. Small ones. Easy to miss. Phone calls became less frequent. Visits became shorter. Family conversations increasingly focused on status, achievements, and appearances. When old stories emerged about difficult times, someone often redirected the conversation. When relatives reminisced about the family's struggles, discomfort seemed to spread across the room. Walter noticed it. But he rarely mentioned it. Perhaps because he understood something many parents eventually learn. Children don't always carry the past the same way their parents do. Some honor it. Some avoid it. And some spend years trying to escape it. Among all the grandchildren, only Emily seemed deeply interested in Walter's memories. As a child, she asked questions nobody else asked. What was Grandma Margaret like? How hard was life after she died? Were you ever scared? Did you ever think about giving up? Walter answered honestly. Not because he wanted sympathy. Because Emily genuinely cared. Their bond strengthened over the years. Even as the rest of the family grew busier, Emily continued visiting. She brought groceries when his mobility declined. She attended medical appointments when others were unavailable. She called simply to talk. When friends asked Walter which grandchild visited most often, he always smiled before answering. Emily. The answer never changed. Years later, when Emily announced her engagement, Walter was among the first people she called. He cried after hanging up. Not because he was sad. Because he felt grateful. He believed he would witness another milestone. Another generation beginning its journey. And Emily made him a promise. A promise several people later remembered hearing. She told him he would sit in the front row. Not hidden in the back. Not treated like an obligation. Beside the family. Where he belonged. Walter never forgot those words. Unfortunately, he wasn't the only one thinking about the wedding. Behind the scenes, other conversations had already begun. Conversations that sounded practical at first. Harmless, even. Until they weren't. As wedding planning accelerated, David, Susan, and Michael became increasingly focused on details. Guest lists. Photography arrangements. Corporate associates. Community leaders. Professional contacts. The wedding was becoming more than a family celebration. It was becoming a public event. An opportunity to showcase success. And as attention shifted toward appearances, an uncomfortable topic kept resurfacing. Walter. The discussions rarely started directly. Instead, concerns arrived disguised as compassion. Someone would mention his health. Someone else would mention mobility issues. Another would question whether the long ceremony might tire him. Each concern sounded reasonable in isolation. Together, they formed a pattern. One Emily couldn't quite understand. Then came the photographs. A planning session months before the wedding produced the first major disagreement. The photographer asked for a list of family groupings. Simple enough. Except Walter's placement kept changing. Initially, he appeared in nearly every major family portrait. Then revisions began. Certain photos excluded him. Others moved him to outer positions. Some drafts removed him entirely. Emily noticed immediately. When she asked why, explanations arrived quickly. They claimed they wanted shorter photography sessions. They worried about fatigue. They insisted they were trying to make things easier for him. But something about their reactions felt rehearsed. Almost defensive. And for the first time, Emily sensed tension she couldn't explain. The situation grew stranger weeks later. At a family dinner, Walter accidentally spilled water while reaching for a glass. It wasn't dramatic. An elderly man with arthritis had knocked over a drink. The tablecloth absorbed most of it. Yet the silence that followed felt disproportionate. David looked embarrassed. Susan looked frustrated. Michael avoided eye contact. Walter apologized repeatedly. Nobody openly criticized him. But Emily noticed the expressions. And she noticed Walter noticing them. The conversation never fully recovered. That night, while driving him home, Walter stared quietly through the passenger window. After several minutes, he finally spoke. Do you ever feel like people stop seeing who you are and start seeing what you've become? Emily asked what he meant. Walter smiled weakly. Then changed the subject. At the time, she didn't push further. Later, she wished she had. Because only days afterward, something happened that transformed suspicion into certainty. Emily accidentally overheard a conversation. Not the entire conversation. Just enough. David and Michael were discussing wedding logistics in another room. She heard her grandfather's name. Then she heard a sentence she couldn't forget. We can't risk him making us look bad. The words hit her immediately. Look bad. How? Walter wasn't disruptive. He wasn't cruel. He wasn't reckless. What exactly were they afraid of? When Emily entered the room unexpectedly, the conversation ended. Both men looked startled. Neither offered an explanation. And neither seemed eager to continue discussing the topic. At that point, Emily realized there was far more happening beneath the surface than anyone wanted to admit. But even she couldn't imagine how far her relatives were willing to go. Because 1 week before the wedding, Walter received a request that left him sitting alone in his living room for nearly an hour. A request so painful that he never told Emily about it. At least not immediately. And when the truth finally emerged, it became impossible to view the upcoming wedding the same way again. Stay with me. Because what Walter's children asked him to do next would reveal exactly how they saw the man who had spent his entire life putting them first. And by the time wedding day arrived, the damage had already been done. 1 week before the wedding, Walter Carter received a phone call from his oldest son. At first, the conversation sounded ordinary. David asked about his health. He asked whether Walter needed transportation to the ceremony. He asked whether everything was ready. Then the conversation shifted. Carefully. Deliberately. David suggested that attending the full wedding might be difficult for someone Walter's age. The ceremony would be long. The reception would be crowded. There would be cameras everywhere. Important guests. Business associates. Community leaders. Perhaps, David suggested, it might be easier if Walter simply joined the family for a private dinner afterward. Walter immediately understood what was happening. The words sounded polite. The message underneath them did not. For several seconds, he said nothing. Then he asked a simple question. Are you asking me not to come? David didn't answer immediately. And in that silence, Walter found the answer. When the call ended, he sat alone in his kitchen staring at a photograph of Margaret. The woman who had never lived long enough to see their children become adults. The woman who had trusted him to hold the family together. According to notes Emily would later discover among Walter's personal belongings, he spent much of that evening debating whether he should attend at all. Part of him wanted to stay home. Part of him wanted to avoid becoming a source of conflict. But another part remembered Emily's promise. A front row seat. A place beside family. A place he had earned. By the morning of the wedding, he had made his decision. He would go. Not for himself. For Emily. And so, shortly before the ceremony, Walter arrived at the venue carrying a small envelope. Inside was a handwritten letter for his granddaughter. A letter he hoped to give her after the ceremony. Unfortunately, he never got the chance. As he approached the entrance, David, Susan, and Michael intercepted him. Witnesses later described the interaction differently. Some said it looked like a family discussion. Others said it appeared tense from the beginning. What everyone agreed on was Walter's expression afterward. Because when the conversation ended, he looked devastated. His children had made their position clear. They didn't want him inside. Not in front of the guests. Not in the photographs. Not at the ceremony. Their reasoning varied depending on who was telling the story. Health concerns. Stress concerns. Logistical concerns. But the message remained unchanged. Please leave. Imagine that moment. Imagine spending decades sacrificing for your family. Imagine missing meals so your children could eat. Working extra shifts so they could attend college. Giving away savings, property, retirement plans, and opportunities. Then imagine being told you might embarrass the very people whose lives you helped build. What would you have done? Would you have argued? Would you have demanded your place? Or would you have walked away? Walter chose the third option. He handed David the envelope intended for Emily. Then he turned around and left. No scene. No confrontation. No public humiliation. Just quiet heartbreak. And perhaps that was what made it so painful. Inside the venue, the wedding proceeded as planned. Emily walked down the aisle. The guests applauded. The vows were exchanged. The photographs were taken. But one seat remained empty. The seat reserved for Walter. Emily noticed immediately. At first she assumed he was running late. Then she assumed he wasn't feeling well. By the reception, concern had replaced confusion. Every explanation she received felt incomplete. David claimed Walter became tired. Susan suggested he preferred staying home. Michael insisted everything was fine. Yet nobody seemed willing to look her in the eye. And then came the moment that changed everything. During the reception, Emily asked for a private moment with her father. The conversation lasted less than 5 minutes. When she emerged, guests noticed tears in her eyes. The celebration continued, but something had shifted. Emily had learned the truth. Her grandfather hadn't missed the wedding. He had been removed from it. What happened next surprised everyone. Instead of ignoring the information, Emily left her own reception. Not permanently. Just long enough to find Walter. And what she discovered inside his modest home would begin unraveling a family narrative that had existed for decades. When Emily arrived, Walter seemed almost embarrassed. Not angry. Not bitter. Embarrassed. As though he were somehow responsible for what had happened. The conversation that followed lasted hours. At first Walter defended his children. He insisted they meant well. He minimized the situation. He attempted to protect them. Then Emily noticed several boxes stored inside a hallway closet. Boxes filled with records. Receipts. Letters. Financial documents. Property records. College payment histories. Mortgage paperwork. The evidence told a story Walter never had. One by one, Emily began connecting pieces of the past. The land Walter sold had funded David's law school education. The retirement account he sacrificed had financed Susan's medical training. Loans Walter quietly assumed had helped launch Michael's first business. In several cases, Walter remained responsible for debts years after his children became financially successful. And yet, almost nobody knew. Not friends. Not colleagues. Not even some extended relatives. Walter had never spoken about it. He never wanted credit. He simply wanted his children to succeed. But as Emily examined document after document, another realization emerged. The family's success story had always been incomplete. Not false. Just incomplete. The public narrative celebrated achievement. The private reality revealed sacrifice. And somewhere along the way, acknowledging Walter's sacrifices had become uncomfortable. Because doing so forced people to remember where they started. At this point, nobody realized the most emotional revelation was still ahead. Among the documents sat an old handwritten letter. The letter was addressed to Margaret. Written shortly after her death. In it, Walter made a promise. He promised that no matter how difficult life became, he would give their children every opportunity possible. He promised he would never allow them to feel limited by poverty. And finally, he wrote something that left Emily speechless. If they succeed one day, I don't need them to thank me. I only hope they remember where they came from. The sentence changed everything. Because suddenly, the wedding wasn't about embarrassment. It wasn't about appearances. It wasn't about an elderly man in an old suit. It was about memory. And whether success had slowly erased gratitude. Emily returned to the reception carrying the envelope Walter originally intended to give her. Before opening it, she made an unexpected decision. She addressed the room. Guests expected a traditional wedding speech. What they heard instead was a family reckoning. Without attacking anyone, Emily began sharing stories about her grandfather. Stories many guests had never heard. Stories about sacrifice. About perseverance. About love expressed through action rather than words. Then she opened Walter's letter. Inside was a message written specifically for her wedding day. He congratulated her. He told her marriage would require patience and forgiveness. He reminded her that family isn't measured by appearances but by loyalty during difficult times. And at the end, he wrote something that left many guests wiping away tears. You never outgrow the people who carried you when you couldn't walk alone. Silence filled the room. Not uncomfortable silence. Reflective silence. The kind that arrives when people recognize a truth they've avoided. Several guests later described that moment as the real turning point of the wedding. Because for the first time, everyone understood what had actually happened. Walter had not embarrassed the family. The family had embarrassed itself. The realization hit David, Susan, and Michael differently. Each had spent years convincing themselves that image and reputation were signs of success. Yet standing inside that reception hall, listening to their father's sacrifices being acknowledged publicly, they were forced to confront something difficult. The very qualities that helped them succeed had originated with Walter. His discipline. His work ethic. His resilience. His willingness to endure hardship for people he loved. The irony was impossible to ignore. The men they viewed as a reminder of an uncomfortable past was the reason they had escaped that past in the first place. Later that evening, something happened that few people expected. The three siblings drove together to Walter's house. No audience. No guests. No speeches. Just family. The details of that conversation remain private. But according to Emily, it lasted well into the night. There were apologies. There were tears. There were admissions that should have happened years earlier. And while decades of hurt cannot disappear in a single evening, something important began. Honesty. Months later, family photographs finally appeared on the walls of several Carter homes. Not just recent photographs. Older ones too. Pictures from the small house. Pictures from difficult years. Pictures featuring Walter and Margaret. Pictures that reminded everyone where the story truly began. Perhaps that is why this story continues to resonate with so many people. Because it isn't really about one wedding. It's about something many families face. How easily we celebrate success while forgetting the sacrifices that made it possible. How easily gratitude can be replaced by familiarity. How easily people become invisible when they've spent their entire lives putting others first. So here's the question. If someone sacrificed decades of their life to help you become who you are today, would they feel appreciated by the way you treat them right now? Or would they feel forgotten? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. Did Walter's children deserve forgiveness? What would you have done if you were in Emily's position? And have you ever witnessed a family forget the person who helped build everything they have? If this story moved you, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who might need the reminder. Because stories like this matter. They remind us that dignity doesn't disappear with age. And that the people who carried us through life deserve more than our memories. They deserve our respect. Thank you for watching. And make sure you're back tomorrow, because the next story is even more emotional, more unbelievable, and may completely change the way you think about family loyalty, sacrifice, and the secrets people hide behind perfect appearances.